Well, hi, everybody. Kim Winter here from Logistics Executive Group. Thank you for joining us, wherever you are and whatever time it is. Got a very special guest today who is a significant player right across a very wide range of activity in the community, in various countries and in various fields. She's a specialist in leadership. She's an international speaker, a highly recognised author, a teacher with a very big education background, which we will talk about. And she is part of the global majority. And that's a point I want to talk about in a minute. But before we go any further, I will introduce my very special guest, Rosemary Campbell-Stephens MBE. Rosemary, welcome to the show and thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much, Kim. I've been looking forward to this interview. Thank you for inviting me.
No, more than welcome. And as you know, I've been following you on LinkedIn for quite a while, and I hope you've been seeing my comments. But I contacted you a little while ago, about a week ago, to say I was really interested in a post that you put up, and we'll talk about that. It was serious, but it had quite a tinge of humour to it, which attracted me, and we'll talk about that in a little moment. But look, traditionally, I always ask our guests to give us a bit of a background on their upbringing, and I'd love you to do that for us and where it all started for you. And then I want to talk to you about the MBE, because being a member of the British Empire is a very rare and very high accolade by the UK government. And for many of our audience who are not from the Commonwealth, they won't have much of an idea about titles like that or that sort of an award. So perhaps after you've given us your heads up on the upbringing, let's talk about the MBE as well before we get into some of the meat and gravy of the discussion.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kim. Well, as you've said, I come from an education background. I've been a teacher most of my life and now doing sort of leadership work. But that started in Birmingham in the UK, where I was born, to Jamaican parents. So my parents were of the Windrush generation. My father and mother moved from Jamaica to the UK in the 1950s, and they settled in the centre of the UK in a city called Birmingham. And I grew up in a place called Handsworth in Birmingham. So one of four children born to Jamaican parents. My two elder siblings were born in Jamaica and moved out to the UK when they were teenagers. But myself and my younger sister were born in the UK. So I grew up in a city that was very multicultural in many respects, because you had lots of migrant communities that moved to Birmingham. And my primary school that I attended was, I would say, 95% Black in terms of student population, but all white teacher population. In fact, I remember the one little white girl in my class called Linda Monkman. I actually remember her name. I can't imagine how it must have been for Linda to be in a class. She probably thought that she was a Black girl. I don't know. But I had a lovely childhood growing up in Handsworth in Birmingham. Felt very, very secure in terms of my identity as a Black person, because Jamaicans are very international in some respects, but also very nationalistic. So wherever they go, they create a kind of little Jamaica. So we always felt very secure in terms of our identity, etc. My father, though, died when I was very young. So my father died when I was aged 7. And so it's really my mother that, was the main parent in terms of upbringing. And at primary school, I was very bright. I became the head girl at my primary school. And I remember that when it was time for my mother to choose the secondary school that I would go to, she put down 3 schools, but she didn't really know much about the schools in the area, because her older children had, had come over as teenagers. And so they just went to the local school. And my primary head teacher, Mr. Matthews, I remember him to this day, rang my mother and came and asked her to come into school and said, look, the schools that you've chosen, Mrs. Campbell, are not the best schools for Rosemary. She will pass her 11 plus. And I'm really recommending that you only put down one school, that's King Edward's Grammar School. And my mother said, is that a good school then, Mr. Matthews? And he said, yeah, I can highly recommend it. My daughter Claire goes there. And it resonated with me as a little 11-year-old Black girl sitting in my head teacher's office that this head teacher thinks I'm good enough to go to the school that his daughter goes to. And I think I've kind of carried that sense of worth and worthiness from my family and from my early schooling in terms of the things that I've gone on to do since.
Clearly you were impressed by your education because you decided to follow a career in education, and you were involved in a lot of what I can see in your history as disruption and working against old structures. Tell us a little bit about that and what led to the MBE, and just briefly, if you will, what is an MBE when you get to that point, and what did it mean to you at the time?
Okay, so you're right. I've always been in love with education, but I've been in love with education as somebody who wants to challenge the way that education sometimes, for some people, actually reduces what they're capable of. I was inspired to become a teacher at 15 years old when I was watching a news item on the TV, and it was looking at the riots in Soweto when students took to the streets to protest against being taught in Afrikaans, number one, as opposed to the African language of Swahili, and also being reduced, as this young student talked about in the TV interview, by a third-rate Bantu education. And I remember sitting there thinking, I want to be a teacher, and I want to be a teacher that's good enough to stand up in front of students like this. So that's what then propelled me into becoming a teacher. So I trained to be a teacher at Birmingham University, but at the same time, I was active in African Caribbean self-help organizations within Birmingham that were running supplementary schools, because we understood that the education system was disadvantaging us as Black students. So that's what led me to have this kind of love-hate relationship with education. And so I've worked through, I've been an Ofsted inspector, been a government advisor. I've also been a head teacher in schools. And that's why I got the MBE, the 35 years service award. So the MBE is something that is given by the Queen of England, and it is given to recognize service in whatever sphere or field that you come from. And I'm happy and proud to be a recipient of the MBE, but I am ambivalent. I am ambivalent about the fact that the MBE is member of Order of the British Empire, because so much of my disruption, so much of my challenge that I've brought to the education system has been about the colonial nature of the education system, the colonial nature of the education system within the UK and across all of its colonies. And of course, Jamaica falls into that. Yep. So there have been a lot of people who've been surprised, knowing who I am, that I accepted the MBE. But that's where I stand on it, Kim.
Okay, interesting. Well, thanks for sharing that, Rosemary. The issue of colonial education resonates with me. And I actually met the Queen when I was 7 years of age, shook her hand when I was a Boy Scout in New Zealand. A little bit different from getting the award when you got yours. But, the same thing with Polynesian folks in New Zealand make up a huge proportion of our population now in New Zealand. The education system never recognised First Nations, Indigenous, or in our case, Polynesian people, and never took any account of language or cultural issues and cultural aspirations. So, I can fully understand where you're coming from and your journey, which I've studied quite extensively. You mentioned the Windrush Generation. It's probably give us it in 30 seconds, because I'm going to come back and interview you about that at another time. It was a really interesting time in British history.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Windrush is the name of an actual ship.
Yes.
And what it represents is that around about 1947, 1948, Britain was reaching out to its colonies, and in particular to the West Indies, as we defined the Caribbean nations then, and actually asking them, inviting them to come to Britain to be part of rebuilding Britain after World War II. And so those people who traveled over that period of time, I think the Windrush itself, the ship, started sailing in 1948, but it kind of incorporates all of those people who came during that period of time from former colonies like the West Indies.
And of course, we're going to talk about this at a different time, but of course there was a political and cultural catastrophe around the Windrush Generation when not so long ago, the British government decided that everybody who came, from what I can tell, was just about going to be sent back to the Caribbean. And let's just leave that there, because that's a whole nother kettle of fish, right? I mean, that was just an incredible piece of, defunct history in terms of the British Empire, but we'll talk about that another time. Hey, want to get into what you're doing now. I mean, you've written a book which we're going to review separately because it's got so much power packed into that book and so much value for those who read it, especially around leadership. From what I can see, your main area of interest now is leadership. You consult all around the world to different organisations. We're doing some work with you as well, collaborating, which is great. Tell us a little bit about where you're coming from in terms of your interest in leadership, how you're deploying your skills, what sort of workshops you're running. What's the area of interest in that for you?
Okay, Kim. So we have to go back to 2003 for that. In 2003, when I was still in the UK, I now live in Jamaica. But in 2003, when I was in the UK, the government was focused on London and improving London schools. And it came up with a multi-million pound initiative called the London Challenge. And a big part of the London Challenge was about raising the attainment of students in London schools, but also it focused on, well, what kind of leadership do we now need in London schools in order for that to happen? So as part of that initiative, I was invited to develop a leadership program, which I did for the London Challenge, and it was entitled Investing in Diversity. The invitation was, how can we get more Black and Asian people into leadership positions in London schools, particularly given the demographic in terms of the student demographic, which is large minority students. And there was a concern that, well, the leadership in schools and the teachers in schools did not represent the student demographic. All of that was wrapped in, for me, a kind of deficit narrative of ethnic minorities. And I suppose one of the challenges was to change that provocation into an invitation to definitely look at leadership, Definitely look at how we can get more Black and Asian people into leadership positions, but let's stop calling them minorities, and let's start acknowledging that they're part of the global majority, not just in London, but also on planet Earth. And then we might have a chance of having a different kind of educational process that centers and situates people from the global majority. So that's how I came into the work on leadership.
Yeah, that was one of the things that attracted me to your front page on LinkedIn, was a member of the global majority, and you and I have spoken about that off camera, of course. So yeah, it's this whole mindset, isn't it? It's this mindset that Black people are a minority or Indian people are a minority. When in actual fact, when you look at the world population, the majority, and that's all there is to it. So I guess this is the hangover from colonial days and from earlier times in history, and that's part of the disruption that you're going down the road of. Talk to me a little bit about the core aspects of leadership that are of real interest to you, and why you've been so successful and are being successful, and I'm sure will be forward, in working with especially corporates around the issue of leadership. What is it about you that's different and that you're bringing to the table, that people that are getting hold of and that it's resonating with them?
Well, I think the difference is coming from a global majority mindset.
Yeah.
So once we've established who the global majority actually is, then there's the understanding of why and how they were minoritized in the first place. And if you see minoritization as a kind of form of neocolonialism, for want of a better term, then if you start thinking, if corporations and organizations start to think from a global majority mindset, in the interests of the majority, not in terms of the greed of the minority, then how does that shift your systems and your processes? Well, for a start, you begin to understand that your systems and your processes aren't neutral, that they actually come from theoretical, philosophical underpinnings that have excluded 85% of the world's population. They come from a very narrow frame of reference. And, they come from a place of whiteness, Kim, to be clear about that.
Yeah, systemic.
Absolutely systemic. And so one of the things that I encourage and invite people to do is to think about, well, look, if there's a shortage in talent, if we can't find the talent that's out there, what is it that should we simply be looking to diversify our talent pool by inviting people in from different backgrounds to sit in a situation that doesn't acknowledge or recognize them, or that doesn't work in their interests or come from their perspective? So the invitation is, yes, certainly diversify, but what are you including people into? Is it the space that needs to change? Yeah. Is it the way of thinking that needs to change? Are there other global paradigms, other lenses that we can have on economy, on education, on climate change, on logistics? Are there other global paradigms that we can draw on? I've certainly heard you talk in some of your interviews, for example, with other people about coming from a Maori perspective or coming from, an Aboriginal perspective. And I suppose that's what I'm trying to do through this global majority concept, to situate those global paradigms.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And even though you and I have spoken off camera, you're sort of digging for me up things that I hadn't really thought of before this conversation, because as a global headhunter over the last couple of decades or so, certainly we're seeing now a lot more HR directors and executives of our global clients saying to us, hey, we really want to see a diversity in amongst the shortlist of candidates for the CEO role or the MD role or the operations manager or the HR role. We definitely want to see diversity. But when I think about it, inevitably what they're talking about is we want to see more women. Nobody plays the race card. Nobody's prepared to talk about the fact, hey, we want some cultural diversity. We want some Black people. We want some Asian people. We want some Indian people. We want to really mix it up. And unless you as a headhunting organisation can bring that level of diversity to us, you're not doing your job. Now, as it happens, we're quite aware in diversity matters and one thing and another. You're aware of our experiences and a lot of stuff we do, humanitarian area as well, and particularly in Africa and what have you. So we've got that mix, but it's a journey that never ends. It's a journey that many companies have hardly ever started. And I must say that when I think about it, talking to you right now, diversity to a lot of organisations means let's get more women in. There's not enough women there. So it's a big issue.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's not only let's get more women in, Kim, because if I turn up as a Black woman, it's also about how those women, are we actually encouraged to bring diversity of thinking in terms of how we approach, let's get more women.
Not how you look.
What's going to change as a result of the what I bring as a Black womanist into your organization? What cultural change, what policy change, what praxis, what practical change are you expecting to bring? And that's why I see a lot of the diversity, as you rightly say, and inclusion narrative really being about let's diversify the people that are still practicing whiteness in our organization. So it's still coming from a white frame of operating, but it's a Black woman that's doing it. So we're being diverse. And inclusion, therefore, is really about me assimilating into a way of thinking and a way of operating that perpetuates the status quo. Because I ask people, when they talk about diversity, why do they want to be diverse? What is it that they want to change? Is it just simply crudely about reaching a wider market? Because we understand, that the markets are, the global majority is your market, So is it about reaching out and making more money that way? Or is it that you actually want to diversify the way that you think about your business? Is there a cultural change that you're inviting here?
Yep.
And it often isn't, Kim. It often isn't.
And it's not so much as I've got to say I've witnessed in the world of global search and executive recruitment. It's not a matter of just stacking the executive team or the boardroom with women or people of colour. It's that whole methodology of thinking. I think one of the most incisive comments I heard once the Black Lives Matter movement gained so much traction after a lot of the unfortunate police killings in America in the recent years that we're very well aware of. And one of the most incisive comments I heard was online, Black Lives Matter. And then there was a subline, but hey, white people, what are you doing and what are you thinking? As opposed to, Black Lives Matter, but, let's just move on. It's what are we doing to change stuff? What are we doing? Because we're theoretically the majority. Well, as you were very well pointing out, white people aren't the majority. They're the minority. But control, systemic processes, politics, social, political, economic, and business environments. So there's so much work to be done. And, I can see where the work that you're doing brings a whole new perspective and an insight into the way organisations operate, think, strategize, and execute inside their businesses, and how they deal with their customers. Because certainly one of the things we're noticing as a search organisation around the world is that more and more customers are wanting to know that their suppliers are aware and are actioning, issues of equity, of diversity, of a whole range of these matters which previously haven't gained as much emphasis in the boardroom, especially, as they should have.
Absolutely. And forcing us to humanize our processes, I think, and that's one of the perspectives that I try to bring to the table when working with organizations. To what extent can we humanize our processes so that there doesn't have to be a business case to act ethically and to do the right thing and to ask the right questions about who benefits and who doesn't from this or that activity. So it's about remaining relevant, but it's also about getting us all to vibrate at the highest level of our humanity and understand that all of us, irrespective of background, Kim, we're all intellectual, emotional, spiritual, ancestral, and tribal people. And we need to be good ancestors, basically. We need to be paying forward.
Absolutely. Hey, Rosemary, so much insight there, and thanks for your honesty in your discussion and bringing those issues out. We need more of that, of course. We're going to come back and talk again, not only about Windrush, we're also going to review your latest book. So much to talk about. Really appreciate your time. Before you go, I always like to have our guests give some insight for our audience in any particular area that they can contribute. One thing from you as an entrepreneur, as somebody who started your own business after a fairly long corporate career and government career, what would be one, whether it be young Black people in the UK, whether it be people in Jamaica, where you are so jealous that you're in Jamaica right now, or anywhere else in the world, one tip from you as an entrepreneur for people wanting to make their way in a very uncertain and very dynamic world that we currently live in today?
Understand and embrace who you are and what you bring. I think being is more important than doing. And one of the things that I've always said to people when they say to me, look, we want more people from different backgrounds. We want people to bring their difference, is that I bring my entirety to this space. And what we need are spaces where people can be. I think that the other thing for me that comes out of Black Lives Matter is that phrase, I can't breathe. And so much of humanity can't breathe. They can't breathe in spaces that do not enable and encourage and nurture their capacity to be. And being is very important.
Be it all day, every day, all around the world. And never a truer word said. Rosemary Campbell-Stephens, member of the Order of the British Empire, an absolute delight to speak with you. And I thank you so much for your time. We thank our audience for joining us, and we'll look forward to catching up with you again.
Thank you so much, Kim. It's been a pleasure.
Cheers.